You were never meant to inherit anything, my mother said calmly, sliding the document across the table. Cressida smiled. You built it, sister. We own it. I didn't argue. I stood up, already dialing. Schedule an emergency board meeting, I said. Hours later, silence filled the room as votes shifted. When the doors closed behind them, I finally exhaled. The morning air in Chicago doesn't just whistle, it bites. At 6:30 a.m., the Willis Tower stands like a lonely sentinel against a sky bruised with hues of deep purple and cold gold. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 82nd floor, watching the city pulse into life. Down there, millions were waking up to their own ordinary struggles, unaware of the silent war beginning in this room. My reflection in the glass looked like a stranger. Inessa, the chief operating officer of Santi & Company, dressed in a charcoal blazer that felt more like a suit of armor than professional attire. I didn't feel anger yet. Instead, there was a meticulous rhythmic grace to my movements as I organized my desk. I have spent 15 years building this firm from the scorched earth my father left behind. He used to tell me, with that gravelly voice of his, that true leadership isn't about the name on the door. It's about the weight you carry for those who can't walk themselves. I took those words to heart. I became the spine of this family, the one who held everything upright while the others simply admired the view. I opened my laptop, the soft glow illuminating the dark grain of the mahogany desk. I began a routine audit of our digital vaults. Cressida, my older sister and our vice president of marketing, had been negligent again. A series of filings for the Northside Development Project were riddled with errors, clumsy mistakes that could cost us thousands in city fines. I didn't call her. I didn't report it to the board. I simply leaned into the screen and fixed them, one by one. Grace is a gift you give yourself, a way to maintain your own standards even when those around you have none. I sipped my espresso, the bitterness a familiar companion, choosing strength over the easy path of resentment. The atmosphere shifted when I stumbled upon an encrypted folder I hadn't seen before. It was buried deep within the fiduciary archives, hidden behind layers of old server code. It was labeled Lineage Realignment. My pulse didn't quicken. It slowed down, a cold, predatory focus taking over. I am a woman of logic, of numbers and hard facts. I don't believe in coincidences. The file was dated 3 months ago. As I navigated through the digital subdirectories, my stomach didn't just drop, it turned to ice. There it was, a formal transfer of shares. 45% of the total family equity, the controlling interest my father intended to be split equally, had been moved entirely to Cressida. My eyes scanned the bottom of the document, searching for the legality of such a move. I found a voluntary renunciation of inheritance form. At the bottom of the page, beneath the bold black text, was my signature, Inessa Sante. But I had never signed this. I had never even seen this. The loops of the S, the sharp tail of the A. It was a masterpiece of forgery. Under Illinois law, a forged signature on a fiduciary document isn't just a family squabble. It's a felony. Yet as I stared at the screen, the realization was far more devastating than the legal implications. This wasn't Cressida's doing. She didn't have the patience or the intellect for a heist this clean. The architect was Sante, my mother. She had stood at the center of this house, playing the role of the grieving widow and the proud matriarch, while secretly treating her youngest daughter like a ghost. I thought I was the foundation of this empire, the one keeping the roof over our heads. In reality, I was merely the labor, a tool to be used until I was no longer convenient. They didn't just want the money, they wanted to erase me from the history of my own life. I stared at the blinking cursor, the silence of the office becoming deafening. A loud voice is a sign of weakness, a desperate plea for attention. True power resides in the silence before the storm. I didn't reach for the phone to scream at my mother. I didn't storm down to the Gold Coast mansion to demand an explanation. I simply sat there, my hands perfectly steady on the keyboard. I looked at the framed photograph of my father on the corner of my desk. He was smiling, his eyes crinkled with the kind of integrity that seems to have died with him. I whispered to the empty room, my voice a low, steady vow. I wasn't going to fight them for the money. Money is just paper and ink. I was going to fight for the integrity of the name he spent his life building. I was going to fight for the version of myself that they tried to bury. I began my first strategic move. I didn't delete the folder. That would be an amateur's mistake. Instead, I initiated a secure, encrypted backup to an external server Alaric had set up for me years ago. This was the first pebble, the beginning of an avalanche of legal accountability that they would never see coming. Forgiveness is a balm for the soul, a way to move on. But boundaries? Boundaries are for the survival of the spirit. That was the moment I was no longer just a girl. I became the consequence of their choices. I was no longer the girl waiting to sit at the table. I was the one who would smash that table, piece by piece, until the truth was the only thing left. The sun finally broke over the horizon, flooding the office with a blinding white light. I closed my laptop slowly, the click of the lid sounding like a gavel in a courtroom. I checked my reflection one last time. The woman who had walked into this office at dawn was gone. In her place stood a stranger with a plan. A woman who understood that sometimes you have to let the fire burn everything down just to see what's left in the ashes. The glass and steel hum of the Willis Tower felt a lifetime away as I pulled my sedan onto the gravel driveway of the Sante estate. In Chicago's Gold Coast, wealth doesn't just talk. It whispers through ivy-covered brick and wrought iron gates that look more like cage bars than decorations. 2 days had passed since I sat in the pre-dawn light and watched my name be forged out of my father's legacy. I wasn't the same woman who had naively believed that hard work was a currency for love. My heart was a vault now, locked and silent, waiting for the right key. The scent of Chanel No. 5 and expensive cedarwood hit me the moment I stepped into the foyer. It was the smell of my childhood, polished, suffocating, and entirely manufactured. My mother, Santa, was waiting in the dining room, her posture as perfect as the porcelain tea set on the table. She looked up, her face softening into that practiced expression of maternal concern that had fooled me for 35 years. "Inessa, darling, you look exhausted," she murmured, gesturing toward the seat at the far end of the long mahogany table. "The company is demanding too much of you. It breaks my heart to see you so drained." The dinner was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Sante had left the head of the table empty, my father's chair, a silent, heavy reminder of the vacuum he left behind. She spoke of his honor, his dedication to the family name, and how he would have done anything to keep our roof over our heads. It was a guilt-tripping symphony. Cressida wasn't there. She was resting upstairs after an exhausting day of shopping on Michigan Avenue, but her presence was everywhere in the mounting piles of legal binders Sante eventually slid toward me. "Cressida made a minor oversight, Inessa," Sante said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "A high-interest commercial loan for her marketing firm. The bank is being difficult. They're threatening the family's liquid assets. We need a guarantor. Someone with a clean record. Someone like you." I looked at the binder. I didn't need to open it to know what was inside, yet I did so with slow, deliberate movements. Toxicity often hides in the word family, like a wolf in sheep's clothing, and I could hear the wolf breathing. Sante pleaded with her eyes, clutching a lace handkerchief. "We have to stay together, Inessa. For your father. You're the only one who can save us." I ran my fingers over the edge of the paper. Under the light of the chandelier, the fine print began to reveal the true depth of the trap. If I signed this document, I would become personally and solely liable for millions of dollars in Cressida's personal debt. It was a masterpiece of financial predation. My mother wasn't asking for help. She was asking me to volunteer for financial execution so that Cressida's secret shares remained shielded and her lifestyle untouched. They weren't just taking my inheritance anymore. They were coming for my future. "I understand, Mother," I said, my voice low and steady. "I know how much Dad cared about this house." I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my pen. It was a heavy silver instrument, a gift from a client, or so I had told them. In reality, it was a high-end smart pen equipped with a micro camera and a high-fidelity microphone. I clicked it twice. I wasn't signing because I was a victim. I was signing because I needed them to believe I was still their puppet. In the theater of betrayal, the best way to win is to let the villain think they've already finished the script. "Inessa, you're sure?" Sante asked, her voice trembling with a fake cocktail of relief and hesitation. "It's just a formality, of course. We would never let anything happen to you." Of course, Mother, I replied, looking her directly in the eye. I'll sign this because I still believe in the values Dad taught me, even if the world has forgotten them. I watched my hand move across the page. The ink flowed smoothly, dark and permanent, binding me to a debt that wasn't mine. My mother's sigh of relief was the most honest sound she had made all night, but it wasn't born of love. It was the sound of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. As the corporate notary stamped the documents, I felt a strange sense of calm. I had just handed them a loaded gun, but I was the one who controlled the firing pin. Under Illinois law, a contract signed under fraudulent inducement, especially when recorded, is a house of cards. Sante's verbal assurances that this was just a formality were now immortalized in digital amber. Every lie she told to get me to sign that paper was another nail in the coffin of her own authority. I stood up, refusing the tea she offered. I should get back to the office. There's a lot of work to be done if we're to keep this family afloat. I walked out of the mansion and into the cool, damp Chicago night. The silence of the Gold Coast felt different now. No longer oppressive, but expectant. I climbed into my car and sat for a moment, the engine idling. My knuckles were white as I gripped the steering wheel, but I wasn't shaking. I was vibrating with a cold, calculated resolve. I took the smart pen and plugged it into my laptop, watching the file transfer progress bar crawl toward completion. I immediately uploaded the recording and the scanned loan documents to Alaric's secure server. This was the second pillar of my counteroffensive. True strength isn't about refusing to walk into a trap. It's about making sure you own the trap once you're inside. By signing that paper, I hadn't just saved their house. I had bought the time I needed to finalize the coup. Sante would be so busy celebrating her victory over me that she wouldn't see the board meeting coming until the doors were locked behind her. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror as I pulled away from the curb. My eyes were devoid of tears. The sorrow had been replaced by a sharp, clinical clarity. They think they are burying me, but they don't realize I am a seed. Every shovelful of dirt they throw on me only brings me closer to the day I break through the surface. The city lights of the loop began to flicker in the distance, a sea of diamonds against the black silk of the lake. I wasn't just a daughter anymore. I was a strategist. The gravel road leading away from the Sante estate was a dark ribbon cutting through the manicured lawns of the Gold Coast. I drove toward the city, the heavy silence of the car cabin acting as a buffer against the lingering scent of my mother's perfume. I was a strategist now, but even the best chess players feel the weight of the pieces they are forced to sacrifice. The following Saturday arrived with a biting chill that rattled the window panes of my apartment. Tonight was the family's annual foundation gala, an event usually reserved for celebrating our collective success. Tonight, however, the air felt thick with a predatory intent. I stepped out of the black sedan and onto the red carpet rolled out before our family mansion. The house was a temple of visual luxury, baccarat crystal chandeliers casting fractured rainbows across marble floors, a string quartet playing a hauntingly perfect Vivaldi, and the low, synchronized hum of Chicago's elite. I was wearing a modest, high-necked black dress. It was elegant, but it served as my private shroud, a silent mourning for a family bond that had been systematically dismantled by the very people who claimed to cherish it. As I entered the ballroom, I saw Sante and Cressida standing near the grand staircase. They were huddled with the city's top real estate moguls, their laughter bright and hollow. I watched them for a moment from the shadows. They were already positioning Cressida as the new face of Sante and Company, treating me as if I were a piece of furniture that had been moved to the basement to make room for a newer, shinier model. "Inessa, you actually came," a voice murmured behind me. It was Mrs. Gable, a longtime family friend whose eyes were always searching for the latest scandal. "I heard you were taking a step back from the executive side." "I am where I am needed, Mrs. Gable," I replied, my voice as smooth as polished stone. I didn't offer a smile. I didn't need to. I moved through the crowd, ignored by the people I had spent years making money for. Despite the cold shoulder from the guests, I found Mrs. Higgins, our elderly retired maid, sitting quietly in a corner alcove. She looked frail, her hands trembling as she held a glass of water. I knelt beside her, away from the prying eyes of the photographers. "Inessa, dear," You look like your father tonight, she whispered, her eyes misty. Thank you, Mrs. Higgins. How is Arthur? I asked, sliding a thick, unmarked envelope into her vintage handbag. It was enough cash to cover her husband's surgery and 6 months of recovery. You shouldn't have, she gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Kindness is a quiet choice, Mrs. Higgins. It doesn't need a spotlight to be real, I said, squeezing her hand. I stood up, feeling a brief warmth in my chest. True nobility isn't found in a title or a share certificate. It's found in how you treat those who can do absolutely nothing for you. That was a lesson my father taught me, and it was one my mother had clearly decided to unlearn. The music suddenly stopped. A heavy, expectant silence fell over the ballroom. A single spotlight cut through the dimness, focusing on the grand staircase. Sante stood at the top, her diamonds catching the light like shards of ice. Cressida was beside her, looking radiant and entirely undeserving. Ladies and gentlemen, Sante's voice projected with practiced grace, tonight is about legacy. It is about the future of Sante and Company and the values we hold dear. I stood perfectly still near the buffet table, a glass of untouched water in my hand. I knew what was coming. I could feel the collective gaze of the room beginning to shift toward me, then back to the stage. My late husband always believed in the fire of vision, Sante continued, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. And tonight, I am passing that flame to the one who embodies his spirit most. I am awarding the Eternal Flame Ring, our family's most sacred heirloom, to my eldest daughter, Cressida. She is the true visionary of our future. The room erupted into polite applause. Sante pulled the ring, the gold band my father wore every day of his life, from a velvet box and slid it onto Cressida's finger. My heart didn't break, it hardened. That ring was never about money. It was a symbol of trust, a promise made to the person meant to guard the family's integrity. Sante looked directly at me, her smile thin and sharp. And to my youngest, Inessa, she said, her voice dripping with a condescending sweetness that made my skin crawl. We thank her for being the loyal help who keeps our house in order while the real leaders dream. Every empire needs a servant, and Inessa has played her part beautifully. The applause that followed felt like a physical blow. The humiliation was calculated, a public execution of my professional standing designed to signal to the board that I had been officially discarded. I could see the city's power players leaning in to whisper, their eyes darting to me with a mix of pity and scorn. Have you ever been told you were a servant in the house you built with your own hands? I didn't flinch. I didn't lower my head. I stood like a silent pillar of strength, my expression unreadable. A lion doesn't lose sleep over the opinion of sheep, and tonight, I was surrounded by a flock of them. I watched Cressida admire the ring, her face flushed with a victory she hadn't earned. She thought she had taken my legacy. She thought she had won. Inessa, dear, be a darling and fetch another bottle of the Krug for table 4? A younger socialite mockingly asked, waving an empty glass toward me. Her friends giggled, waiting for me to snap. Of course, I replied. I didn't react with anger. Anger is an emotional debt you can't afford when you're planning a takeover. I took the tray from a passing waiter and served the table with a smile that was perfectly professional and entirely empty. I was unbreakable by insult because I knew something they didn't. I knew the price of the gold they were wearing. I walked past Sante as she stepped off the stage, the scent of her victory thick in the air. I leaned in, my voice a mere whisper that only she could hear. The ring fits her finger, Mother, but does she have the strength to carry the weight that comes with it? Gold is heavy when it's stolen. Sante's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her eyes before she masked it with a laugh. She had given me exactly what I needed, the final permission to stop being a daughter. The eternal flame was just a piece of metal now. I touched my own bare finger, the skin still pale where my father's promise used to live in my mind. I realized then that they had only taken the gold. They had taken the glitter and the vanity. But I had kept the iron. I had kept the will, the knowledge, and the silent, burning resolve that they had consistently underestimated. As the guests toasted to my sister's bright future, I caught my mother's triumphant gaze and offered a small, knowing smile. The kind you give someone who has just lit a match in a room full of gunpowder. I wasn't just leaving the party. I was leaving the version of myself that had ever wanted their approval. That Inessa was dead. The woman walking out of this mansion was a consequence. The night air in Lincoln Park felt cleaner than the suffocating, perfume-heavy atmosphere of the Gold Coast mansion. I drove in silence, the hum of the tires against the pavement the only sound in the dark cabin. I wasn't running away this time. I was moving toward the only truth left. My hands were steady on the wheel, though the image of my mother's triumphant face burned behind my eyelids like a ghost. I had spent 35 years trying to earn a seat at a table that was built to exclude me. I pulled up to Alaric's private residence, a modest but dignified brownstone tucked away behind a row of ancient oaks. The lights were low in the study, casting long, amber shadows across shelves filled with leather-bound law books and relics of a Chicago that used to value a person's word as much as their bond. I stepped inside, my gala dress feeling like a costume from a play I had finally finished performing. My composure was flickering, a thin wire stretched to its limit, but I refused to let it snap. I wasn't a victim seeking comfort. I was a seeker looking for the key to a lock I finally understood was there. Alaric met me at the door with a quiet nod, his eyes reflecting a fatherly dignity I had been denied just hours before. He didn't offer empty platitudes or pity. He simply led me to a high-backed chair and poured 2 cups of tea, the steam rising in rhythmic swirls. "Justice isn't a loud shout, Inessa," he said, his voice a low, comforting rumble. "It's the quiet click of a key in the right lock. You've spent too long trying to kick the door down." He moved to a small, heavy safe in the corner of the room, his movements deliberate. I watched him, feeling a strange sense of relief in the presence of a true ally. He explained that my father had seen the rot in the foundation of our family's morality long before the end. He knew that Sante's greed and Cressida's entitlement would eventually create a storm that would swallow the legacy he had built. He had left a dormant legal clause within the company's bylaws, a failsafe that could only be triggered by a family member who maintained a clean fiduciary record. I leaned back, the heat of the teacup warming my palms. A person's true legacy isn't what they leave to you in a bank account. It's what they leave in you, the values, the foresight, the strength to stand when the wind is blowing. My father hadn't left me the gold ring. He had left me the map to the kingdom. He knew this day would come, Alaric whispered, sliding a vintage USB drive across the desk. It looked insignificant, a small piece of plastic and metal, but I could feel the weight of it. I watched as Alaric plugged the drive into his laptop. A blinking light signaled the start of a digital playback, and suddenly the room was filled with a sound I thought I'd never hear again. My father's voice. It was gravelly, warm, and possessed a weight that filled the small study. This was the ultimate trust clause, a legal failsafe that granted the COO absolute veto power over share transfers if fraud or coercion was detected. "Inessa," the recording began, and I felt a sharp, icy pang in my chest. "If you are hearing this, the wolves have bared their teeth. Don't hate them from their nature, but don't let them destroy what we built for the people who depend on us. You were always the one meant to lead, not because of your birth order, but because of your heart." The message was a masterclass in paternal protection. It was a message of love and validation that I had craved for decades. He hadn't just given me a legal weapon. He had given me the permission I needed to stop being the good daughter and start being the leader he knew I was. I wiped a single tear from my cheek, the last one I would ever shed for the life I was leaving behind. I felt a new mantra taking root in my soul. Leadership is a stewardship of the weak. It is not a playground for the entitled. Have you ever found a message from someone you lost that felt like they were reaching through time to put a hand on your shoulder? That night didn't end with that recording. The initial release quickly transformed into a tactical, precise data analysis. Alaric and I spent the rest of the night in the digital strategy conference room. We launched Operation Shadow Recruitment. Sante had spent a decade ignoring the company's 5 minority shareholders, treating them more as nuisances than partners. It was time to remind them of his value. We didn't send out emotional pleas. I presented them with a value restoration plan backed by Chicago-style business logic. I showed them the data, proving that Cressida's erratic leadership and Sante's recent lineage realignment would devalue their shares by at least 40% within the next fiscal year. I spoke to them not as a daughter, but as a majority stakeholder in waiting. But I also showed them my heart. I promised to protect the pensions and healthcare of the 2,000 employees that Sante was already planning to streamline to fund Cressida's new Parisian lifestyle. I wasn't just fighting for my shares. I was fighting for the people who kept the lights on in our buildings. Kindness isn't a weakness in business. It's the ultimate leverage when everyone else is acting out of greed. The rhythmic editing of my life was speeding up. Encrypted emails sent, midnight digital handshakes confirmed. Every "I'm in" that flashed on my phone was a pebble added to an avalanche. By the time the first gray light of Monday morning began to creep over Lake Michigan, I finally had the votes. I had the legal standing, I had the truth. I stood up and walked to the window, watching the city wake up. The bruised purple of the previous dawn was now a sharp, clear blue. I looked at the digital file containing my father's voice, feeling the weight of the steel he had placed in my hand. They could keep their eternal flame ring. I finally had the kingdom. The sun broke over the horizon, hitting the windows of the Willis Tower in the distance. I wasn't going back to that office to work. I was going back to take it. I adjusted my coat, the recording of my mother's confession heavy in my pocket, finally knowing exactly who I was up against. The elevator doors of the Willis Tower opened on the 82nd floor with a soft, cold chime. The atmosphere was different, suffocating, full of anticipation, and tinged with a toxic feeling I could finally name. I didn't walk into the office as a victim. I walked like the storm the Sante family had struggled against for decades. My heels clicked on the polished marble, a steady rhythm counting down to a judgment they hadn't even begun to imagine. When I pushed open the heavy oak doors to my private suite, the scene was already set. Sante was sitting in my guest chair, her hands folded over an Hermès bag, looking every bit the grieving, concerned matriarch. Cressida stood by the window, her silhouette sharp against the Chicago skyline. Beside them were two men in dark suits, internal compliance officers I recognized from the audit department. The room felt smaller, the air thick with a manufactured cloud of shame. I didn't break my stride. I sat behind my desk, the very desk they had tried to turn into my coffin. "Inessa, thank goodness you're here," Sante began, her voice a fragile whisper of fake despair. "Something terrible has happened. These gentlemen, they found evidence. Leaked acquisition data, federal trade violations. They say it came from your workstation." I looked at the compliance officers, then back at my mother. I maintained a perfect stoicism. The setup was elaborate. Sante had planted a series of encrypted emails on my server, using a digital duplicate of my fiduciary signature to frame me for insider trading. It was a surgical strike designed to strip me of my standing before I could ever reach the boardroom. A mother should be the first shield of a child, not the first sword that strikes them down. But I knew a core truth that Santa had forgotten. A lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes. But once truth arrives, it never leaves. "It's a federal crime, Inessa," Cressida chimed in, her voice brimming with a malicious glee she couldn't quite hide. "You've ruined everything. Even Dad knew you were just a worker bee, but he never thought you'd be a common thief. You're just like him, weak-hearted and prone to making mess of things." The room seemed to tilt. The mention of my father in her mouth felt like a sacrilege. Sante's eyes snapped toward Cressida, a flash of irritation crossing her face before she turned back to me, her mask of maternal pity slipping. "You've always been a disappointment, Inessa. Always so obsessed with doing things right. You're exactly like your father. He was so busy being principled that he almost destroyed us. I had to fix his messes too." I leaned forward, my eyes locking onto Sante's. "Is that what happened the night he died, Mother? Were you fixing a mess while he was gasping for air on the library floor?" The air left the room. Sante's face went a ghostly shade of gray, her composure fracturing in a way I had never seen. "How dare you!" she hissed, but her voice lacked its usual iron. "He threatened to divorce me!" Sante snapped suddenly, her voice rising into a sharp, arrogant fury. "He found out about the offshore accounts. He was going to cut us off. He was going to give everything to you. The honest child. He was standing there, clutching his chest, shouting about integrity. And then he fell. I didn't kill him, Inessa. I just didn't help him. I waited. I gave him the silence he always wanted. By the time I called 911, the mess was already gone. I froze. The world outside the window, the cars, the lake, the life of the city, simply ceased to exist. She hadn't just betrayed his legacy, she had watched the man she claimed to love die because he stood in the way of her greed. Forgiveness is a noble virtue, but justice is a sacred duty to the dead who can no longer speak for themselves. In that moment, the last thread of family obligations snapped with the sound of a falling guillotine. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and final. Sante realized too late what she had said. She tried to reach out, to pull the mask back over her face, but it was shattered beyond repair. Cressida looked away. The sheer horror of our mother's confession even too much for her to stomach. I felt a low, powerful bass drone vibrating in my soul. Not of anger, but of a quiet, terrifying power. I was going to save you from your own incompetence, Mother, I said, my voice so cold it seemed to frost the glass of the desk. I was going to let you retire with your dignity intact while I fixed the ruins of this company. But you aren't just incompetent. You are a ghost, and it is time for you to stop haunting this house. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small digital recorder. I hit the stop button with a slow, deliberate click. Alaric already has the original server logs. He's known for 2 hours that your insider trading frame was a fabrication, and now he has this. I tapped the recorder against the mahogany. I'm not acting out of hate. I am acting because I am the only one left in this family who still knows the difference between right and wrong. I stood up, adjusting my blazer one last time. I felt lighter than I had in years, the weight of their expectations finally falling away. Leadership is about stewardship, not survival at the cost of others. I am no longer your daughter, Sante. I am the CEO of the company you tried to burn down, and I have an emergency board meeting to attend. I walked toward the door, leaving the two of them in the wreckage of their own malice. Cressida tried to say something, a plea, an insult. I didn't care which, but I didn't stop. The price of my silence had always been your love, I thought as I stepped into the hallway. Since you have none to give, I have no reason to be quiet. I headed toward the grand boardroom, the recording of my mother's confession a heavy, righteous weight in my pocket. For 35 years I had fought for them. For the next 30 minutes I was going to fight for myself. The corridor leading to the grand boardroom was a wind tunnel of pressurized silence. Each step I took toward the 82nd floor's mahogany double doors felt like the heavy rhythmic beat of a war drum. I wasn't just walking into a meeting, I was stepping into the vacuum of my own life. I adjusted the lapel of my suit, feeling the digital recorder's weight against my ribs. For 35 years, I had played the role of the obedient shadow. Today, I was the light that was going to burn the curtains down. I pushed the doors open exactly as the clock struck 10. The room was a tableau of corporate opulence, the long table reflecting the gray Chicago sky, the scent of expensive leather, and the faces of 12 directors who held the fate of my father's empire in their hands. Sante was already at the head of the table, her hands trembling as she held a gavel. Cressida sat to her right, looking like she was ready to celebrate a coronation. They were in the middle of a motion to strip me of my COO title in absentia. "Inessa, you are not authorized to be here!" Sante shrieked, her voice cracking like thin glass. "Security! Remove this traitor immediately! She is under federal investigation." I didn't stop. I walked directly to the empty seat opposite my mother, my movements fluid and dangerously calm. I ignored her outburst and looked at the board members. "Directors," I said, my voice echoing with a low, steady authority. "Before you vote on a lie, I suggest you read the truth." I slid a thick stack of legal injunctions across the table. They fanned out like a hand of winning cards. Sante reached for them, her face a mask of panicked fury, but Alaric stepped forward from the shadows of the doorway. "Those are court-ordered freezes, Sante," he said, his voice cold and professional. As of 3 a.m., I had exercised my emergency COO powers to freeze every corporate and family-linked account tied to Sante and Company. I had cited detected fiduciary irregularities, including the forged renounce inheritance documents and the embezzlement of company funds to cover Cressida's personal debts. Sante and Cressida were now financially paralyzed in the very room they thought they owned. I looked my mother in the eye. True power isn't about how much money you can spend, Mother. It's about how much integrity you can maintain when the gold stops flowing. It seems your vault is empty. The theater of desperation began almost immediately. Sante turned to the board, her queen mother persona crumbling into a sweating, erratic mess. She tried to claim Alaric was senile, that I was a bitter child, that the documents were fakes, but the numbers didn't lie. Alaric projected the audit logs onto the massive wall screen, showing the surgical precision of the theft. Cressida, realizing the ship was sinking, didn't even try to defend our mother. She broke down, sobbing that it was all Sante's idea, that she was just following orders. A family built on greed has no foundation when the storms of reality hit. I watched them with a weary, pitiless patience. I didn't feel joy in their collapse. I felt a profound, exhausting sadness. This was the woman who had raised me, and this was the sister I had protected. And yet, here they were, devouring each other to stay afloat. Realizing she had lost the room, Sante performed her final act. She clutched her chest, letting out a strangled gasp, and collapsed back into her high-backed chair. "My heart," she wheezed, her eyes rolling back. "Adjourn. Call a doctor. I can't breathe!" Cressida screamed for someone to help, but the board members remained frozen, their faces a mix of suspicion and horror. I didn't rush to her side. I didn't mock her. I stood my ground, watching the performance with the detached eye of an auditor. I knew exactly what this medical bluff was designed to do. She needed time. She needed to stop the vote. She needed to regain control of the narrative. I leaned into my lapel mic. "Send them in," I said softly. The boardroom doors opened, and a team of 3 independent, board-certified paramedics entered with a gurney. They didn't work for the city. They were a private team Alaric had secured from one of Chicago's top hospitals. I looked at the stunned directors. "I have prayed for my mother's health every night," I said, my voice cutting through the chaos. "So I wouldn't dream of letting her suffer without the best medical experts Chicago has to offer, right here, right now. They are independent, they are thorough, and they are under oath." The paramedics moved with clinical efficiency. They checked her vitals, ran a portable EKG, and monitored her oxygen levels while the entire board watched in a suffocating silence. Sante tried to maintain the act, but the equipment was unyielding. After 3 minutes, the lead paramedic looked up at me and then at the board. "Her vitals are perfectly stable. Blood pressure is slightly elevated due to stress, but there is no sign of a cardiac event. She is medically fit to continue." The silence that followed was the sound of a reign ending. It was the sound of the final mask falling away to reveal a woman who would fake her own death to keep her grip on power. Sante opened her eyes, the theatrical gasp stopping instantly. She looked at me with a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful. A mother's heart is the child's classroom, but some teachers only teach you how to survive their cruelty. I realized then that I had graduated. I didn't need her approval, and I certainly didn't need her love. I needed the truth to be the only thing left in the room. "The motion for a vote of no confidence is still on the table," I said, my voice regaining its iron. I looked at the directors, men and women who had known my father for decades. "We are not here to punish a family member. We are here to save a legacy that was built on honor, not on lies. My father gave his life for this company. I won't let it be buried with his secrets." I watched each director raise their hand. One by one. A forest of responsibility rising against the woman who had tried to erase me. I watched my mother as the paramedics retreated, her eyes wide with the realization her final performance had failed. The only thing more dangerous than a woman with a plan is a woman who no longer seeks her mother's approval. I was that woman. The frantic energy of the boardroom evaporated the moment the final vote was tallied. I watched the directors file out, their expressions a mix of awe and relief, leaving me in the expansive executive suite as the late afternoon sun began its slow descent over Lake Michigan. The city of Chicago was bathing in a deep, molten amber. the long shadows of the skyscrapers stretching across the streets like the fingers of a past I was finally outrunning. I sat at the head of the mahogany table, not out of a need for triumph, but out of a solemn duty to the name Sante. 2 white envelopes rested before me, stark and clinical against the dark wood. Sante and Cressida stood by the windows, their figures silhouetted against the burning skyline. I didn't rush them. I picked up my fountain pen, the rhythmic scratching of my signature on the final severance filings serving as the only heartbeat in the room. I was no longer a daughter trying to bridge a gap. I was a CEO closing a breached contract. I slid the envelopes toward them. "This is the final reckoning," I said, my voice steady and devoid of the tremors that once defined my interactions with them. I cited the specific violations of the Illinois Business Corporation Act that Alaric had meticulously documented. The embezzlement of corporate funds to cover personal gambling debts, the forgery of fiduciary signatures, and the catastrophic breach of duty. Sante reached for her envelope, her hand trembling as she finally let the tears fall, not for the man she lost, but for the power she was losing. "Inessa, please," she whispered, her voice cracking with a desperate attempt at maternal manipulation. "We are family. Think of the love. Think of the years I spent raising you." I met her gaze, my eyes dry and clear. "Love is a verb, Mother. It is a series of actions rooted in respect. It is not a shield you get to hide behind after you've spent years using it to smother me." I took a deep breath, offering her a final, stoic truth. True forgiveness does not mean allowing the person who hurt you to continue holding the knife. It means taking the knife away so they can't hurt anyone else. I'm not doing this to be cruel. I'm doing this to be clean. The departure was handled with the cold efficiency of a surgical strike. I watched through the internal security monitors as Alaric and a team of guards escorted the former executives toward the grand lobby. The wide cinematic shots of the Willis Tower foyer showed the rhythmic clicking of their heels on the marble, a sound that used to signal my anxiety, but now only signaled a closing door. I had authorized a total purge of their influence. Effective immediately, I revoked every company-leased asset they had treated as birthrights. Cressida's luxury sedan, the corporate-owned penthouse in the Gold Coast, the expense accounts that funded their vanity. Everything was gone. Cressida's screams echoed through the lobby, her voice sharp with the shock of a predator who had finally been defanged. She turned back toward the elevators, shouting about unfairness, but I remained a pillar of calm on the monitor screen. The privilege of leadership is earned through service, not stolen through inheritance. As Sante reached the revolving doors, she stopped and looked up at the security camera, her face twisted with a bitter, ancient rage. "You are a monster, Inessa," she hissed, her words barely audible through the audio feed. "A devil without a heart." I offered her a sad, knowing smile through the lens, though I knew she couldn't see the pity in my eyes. "I am not the monster, Mother," I whispered to the empty room. "I am simply the consequence of every choice you made while you thought I wasn't watching." The doors spun, and they were gone, swallowed by the cold, biting Chicago air and the sea of strangers on the sidewalk. I felt a massive, heavy weight, one I had carried since I was a little girl, finally evaporate. I didn't feel the need to celebrate. I felt the need to breathe. I walked back into my father's old office, the one I had worked in as his helper decades ago. The room was quiet, filled with the scent of old paper and the fading heat of the sun. I sat in his high-backed leather chair, running my hand over the cool mahogany of the desk. My fingers found the small, velvet box Alaric had left there. I opened it, and finally slid my father's heirloom ring onto my own finger. It was cold, heavy, and perfect. It wasn't just a piece of gold anymore. It was a symbol of stolen honor finally returned to its rightful home. "What now, Inessa?" Alaric asked from the doorway, his voice filled with a quiet pride. "Now we build something that actually matters," I replied. "I'm restructuring the Santa Foundation. It's no longer going to be a tax shelter for the elite. It's going to be a legitimate charity for exploited corporate workers, people who were erased just like I was." My victory wasn't about hoarding the wealth. It was about redistributing the justice that had been denied for so long. I stood by the window as the sun sank below the horizon, Chicago beginning to sparkle like millions of diamonds against the backdrop of the silky black lake. A bird perched on a tree never fears a broken branch because it doesn't trust the branch, but its own wings. I spent my whole life clinging to a rotting branch, only to realize that I could always fly. I was no longer waiting for permission to exist. I was no longer seeking a seat at a table that hated me. I know many of you have faced your own storms behind closed doors and fought battles that no one else could see. When was the moment you finally realized it was time to choose yourself over the people who hurt you? I'd love to hear your wisdom in the comments. I truly do read every one of them.